Research Reflection and Practices series. This is a monthly lecture series that we do at SEPA to kind of invite eminent scholars and learn from them, and it's more of it's our learning platform actually. So we share the experience from different scholars in this platform. So we are very honored to have Dr. Ganeshan Wickramaratne today to talk about the sovereign default and economic crisis in Sri Lanka, causes and policy lessons. I think a very important topic. The lectures are coming up, and so we are very honored to have you today. So just to give a little brief profile of Dr. Wickramaratne, some of you must be knowing about him already. So you just Dr. Wickramaratne has held many posts over a career spanning 30 years. He was the Director of Research at the Asian Development Bank Institute in Tokyo. He was the advisor to the Chief Economist of the ADB in Manila. He was the Chief Program Officer at the Commonwealth Secretariat in London, a visiting scholar at the IMF in Washington, D.C. He was the Executive Director of Sri Lanka's Foreign Ministry think tank and a member of the Monetary Policy Consultative Committee of the Central Bank of Sri Lanka. He was also the Executive Director of the Lakshmi Kala Government Institute, and in the private sector, he was the Global Head of Trade and Competitiveness at Maxwell Stampiers in London. Currently, he serves as the advisor to the President of Sri Lanka on strategic trade policy, a professional fellow in economics and trade at Gateway House, the Indian Council on Global Relations in Mumbai, and a non-resident senior fellow at the Institute of South Asian Studies of the National University of Singapore. He has many publications, and he has about 20 books on international economics, regionalism, and economic development, including Asia's free trade agreements and connecting Asia. You go and search for his latest publications are all on the net. And Dr. Wickramaratne has a BPhil in economics from the University of Oxford and an MSc in economics from the University of College of London, and a BSc in economics from the London School of Economics. So I would welcome once again Dr. Wickramaratne to talk about the sovereign default and economic crisis in Sri Lanka, causes and policy lessons. So welcome you.
And then you have this kind of government with 2/3 majority that suddenly gets trunched out of power, you know. And through this Philippine-style mass protest, Meherat and I lived in the Philippines, and we sort of know the history of that people's power story a bit, right? And that's what you right. And then in all of this, there are lots of international elements as well, right? You have global commodity price shocks, which came into the Russia-Ukraine conflict. You have the COVID-19 shock. You have lots of international intervention. So there's a whole IR international dimension. Just try. Sorry. Yeah. Okay. You're doing it. So then you do it. So what I decided to do with all this, and I must confess, inspired by Stiglitz, right? That quote, and sort of thought I must look behind it, is to kind of write a paper. So I'm linked also to the National University of Singapore, and I decided to write what they call a scan, which is basically a 10,000+ word essay on basically what caused all this misery and what might we learn from it. And that's what I'm going to try to do. ISAS, if you're interested, you can download the paper free. And there's also a podcast interview, which I did a couple of weeks ago with a wonderful scholar at ISAS called Ranjini Gamage, who's a political scientist. So we had this little conversation. If you can't be bothered to read the paper, you can listen to the podcast if you want. Next slide, please. Okay, so what I tried to do in the paper was look at this story of what I call development reversal. We often talk about development miracles, right? The East Asian miracle was the big study done by the World Bank back in 30 years ago about how East Asia rose. And then there was a set of studies by people like Alice Armstrong and others who talked about the rise of the rest. So it was beyond East Asia. We went to Brazil and we went to other countries such as India. This Sri Lankan story has the elements of a story of development reversal. So I was very interested in how does development go into reverse, which is something of interest. I'm going to show you some things around it. Then I'm going to look a little bit at some of the causes of the crisis. And there's a sort of a debate. Was it internal factors? Was it external factors? And I'm going to sort of give you my sense of the evidence and the arguments. And there's some literature out there that's very interesting. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about cures. And when I say cures, I really mean, things that were done in the last couple of years to try to arrest the situation. That's what I mean by cures. It's not cures in the long-term sense, per se. It just sounded catchy to have causes and cures kind of thing. That's why I use it this way. Then 2024 and how I read the current situation. And then I think the most interesting piece, what do we learn from our crisis, right, for other countries, right? And because this was published by NUS, the director at the time said to me, what can we tell other countries in Asia not to do with Sri Lanka? So it was a kind of an interesting thing to write because I've written all my professional life in Herat as well and Sirimal about successes and how do you go from success. This was kind of how not to do with Sri Lanka. Right? So I was writing it really with the Bangladeshis in mind. I'd gone to give some lectures in Bangladesh. Said, how can we avoid Sri Lanka? The few months after we defaulted, I was in Malaysia, which had foreign reserves that about the size of the Sri Lankan economy, and they said, how do we avoid defaulting that? So I was inspired by Malaysia and Bangladesh to write this paper, if you like, plus Stiglitz's. Next slide, please. Okay, so let me go into the development reversal rather briefly. There's much more in the paper. Next slide, please. Okay, so the story of Sri Lanka, apart from one place where Sri Lanka was reborn, which was after the end of the conflict, and we come to this scenario where we've actually defaulted in our economy and so on. If you go back, 50 plus years, in the 70s and 80s, Sri Lanka was seen as a development success. And you had another Nobel Prize laureate, Amartya Sen, in a very powerful article in a book and a couple of other pieces, where he thinks it was a basic needs success story, right? So it had very high indicators on maternal mortality rates, which were low, very high literacy, very low infant mortality rates, etc., for a poor country. Okay? At that time, Sri Lanka was a low-income country. It hadn't made this transition to low-middle income 20 decades hence. And so Sri Lanka was talked about in this way, and there was this famous study, Redistributive Growth, by Hollis Chenery and others, which talked about, big debate was, do you redistribute as you grow, or do you distribute first and grow? And Sri Lanka was seen as one that had this welfare state funded by the plantations and independence, with the surpluses, which then funded this welfare state. The problem always in this was that growth was elusive, right? And it was elusive, particularly in this episode in the 70s, where we had the predominant or the premier bout of inward orientation. And the inward orientation led to a very interesting set of distortions. I mean, you had the plantations that were nationalized, which led to the flight of investors. It affected agricultural productivity, exports, and revenue. I'm sure Herat will have lots to say on that, given he's an expert on agriculture. It had ISI, and then a lot of haphazard interventions. And you had this very nice quote from Nandalal Veerasinghe, our current central bank governor. It led to a low investment, low growth, high unemployment economy. So this interesting trilemma of a different type to what we normally think about. And virtuous cycle, I guess, of decelerated growth and distortions. And then with this messed up side on the growth and on the revenue side, on the fiscal policy, you had a high social welfare expenditure that continued, plus the state believing to get involved in most types of economic activity, and you had these ballooning fiscal deficits and other things that came. Now, we then opened up in 1977, and for a temporary period, probably about 4 or 5 years, things were good, if you cast your memory back, right? We transited to labor-intensive manufacturing exports with garments. Growth picked up. I think growth in the 70s was 3%, something at that time. It was 5-6% in that early phase, if my memory serves me right. 78 to about 82 or so was a kind of a boom period. But this was not sustained, so it didn't go from textiles and garments to soft toys to footwear, all those labor-intensive industries, and it didn't get into the medium tech stuff such as electronic assembly and things of that type, partly because of the civil conflict, but probably more importantly because of the lack of reforms. Okay. So we really only did, I guess, 2 broad episodes of reform. The early opening up in 77, and then there was the sort of telecom reform and so on a bit later. It was at 80 something, right? The telecom reform and a bit, and there's not much else that happened, and most of it is reversed. Okay. So in a kind of a nutshell, growth was the problem, right? But welfare was good. Next slide, please. Okay. Now, we already saw by the 2015 government, the signs of sort of stress, right? So you saw basically revenue and GDP, which was pretty low, right? 13-14%. It should really be 15-16% for a middle income country. This is the kind of benchmark or upwards. And part of this was the graduation away of Sri Lanka from a low income country to a low middle income country. Right, that status meant that foreign aid was not. So we lost our grant income. And then the tax revenue part was also not very good. But expenditure stayed very high. And of course, in the post-conflict period, they didn't adjust, for instance, things such as defense expenditure, which was kept at a very high level of GDP. And then there were other things. The subsidies also remained very high. So there was not much adjustment. So there was the gap. And you saw the beginnings of what was happening in this crisis. And then when you get to 2022, you see the collapse of revenue, okay, for various reasons, which I will explain. And then the debt started also rising. And you see this 128% public debt to GDP ratio in 2022. And the debt was in dollars. And then you have this kind of collapse of the reserves. So we begin to see the signs of this reversal picture. There is more in the paper that you can look at. I'll show you a few graphs. Next slide, please. Next slide. Okay, so here is a better picture, and I pull this out of the IMF numbers because it just seemed easier for me to try to use in terms of the way to think about it. And some of these were estimates at the time. There are updated data, and you see the picture very clearly, right? So the revenue collapses year by year, right? So even as COVID comes in, and we really needed the revenue part, with activity going down, it also had collapsed. And there were the tax cuts in 2019, which was one of the major reasons which affected us, and also it lost access to capital markets, which is a big issue. But expenditure remained very high. And of course, in the COVID year, government expenditure was boosted a bit to try to keep the economy going. There was some of the fiscal bit, but it was a very small multiplier because there was no fiscal headroom, but it was a monetary driven multiplier that was particularly important, which I'm quite sure in here. The debt, of course, rises, big jump in debt, and then we get to this point where there's some supposed decline, but the level is still high, 100% plus. The interesting point concomitant to that is this twin deficit issue, right? So you see the import-export gap, and as Silman pointed out this morning, we never have had exports more than $12-13 billion, right? Silman, this is merchandise, I guess, no? This is not services. Yeah, the services makes it about 17-18 million, right? To the extent we can, right? Okay, so even if you have services, it's not going to go into position. So this is, and by the way, that should say foreign reserves. That's not balanced, but that's basically reserves in that. Next slide, please. And here is the growth picture. So we have this kind of topsy-turvy growth pattern with this big hit during COVID, which goes down, and then we have the recent episode leading up to the default. And you see the picture of this economy that's kind of in trouble. And this, of course, was the second episode of the sort of closing up time and so on, right? So you have this picture where there was a plantation economy that gave surpluses that then funded welfare services fairly well. Public finances we're talking about 60s, basically, up to public depends about the 60s. And then that starts getting stressed in the 70s with balance of payments problems, plus this kind of import substitution, welfare orientation, haphazard intervention pattern. You open up, and that has this problem of the conflict that comes a few years later and the lack of reform, right, in the pattern of growth. And then, you have the hits from other shocks from COVID and so on. And then you have a second bout of kind of inward-oriented homegrown solutions over 2 or 3 years. And then you end up in this pattern. And kind of that's where we are. So there's this picture, and then per capita incomes will take another few years to recover, right? And that's the pattern, right? So incomes have fallen. And so you have this picture. Next slide, please. And then, of course, more people have got poor in Sri Lanka, right? So the number was some 11% before, and 11% I think was a real number, right? Srimal, we discussed it. No, that was a real number done from the census. And then these are all micro simulations, right? Done by the World Bank and so on. And then you have this big jump there. And then you were telling me that based on the national poverty line, Rohan Samriddhi was people said a third of the people in Sri Lanka are poor, right? And then you have the UNDP report that some of you all may know. I don't know if anyone is here from UNDP. Is anybody from UNDP here? Okay. You all have this deprived number, deprivation. Sri Lankans are deprived. 50% of Sri Lankans are deprived because when you're taking health access and education and some other things, in addition to income, you have 50%, right? So one of the things I'd be very interested in is what do we make of the poverty numbers, and I'm sure Herat will elaborate. Yes, but so this crisis has led to a deterioration in the human condition, and that's the way I'm seeing this in terms of not just the macro, but also this issue. And some of the World Bank data tells you it's an urban phenomenon, okay, but I suspect it's an island-wide phenomenon. It's an urban phenomenon, what I sort of understand. And then you have this very interesting data that I remember reading on child malnutrition, which appears to have jumped in terms of the numbers, because they measure under 5 birth weights and stunting and things for every kid in the country. I understand there is this thing done by the health department. I was quite shocked when I saw those numbers, which are available on the Ministry of Health site. So there are other things you can add that shows there are problems, right, in the industry. Next slide. Okay, so I think we all hopefully will agree on some of the data points of where we are. Let's look at these causes. And in the causes, I was a bit selective. I decided to pick what I read in sort of academic literature and some of what I picked up in the popular discussion as to where we are, right? And I sort of split it into internal and external causes to try to understand. And I'll give you a quick take, but there's more of an analysis in the paper. Next slide, please. Okay, the first is this thing that we talk a lot about, the twin deficits. So persistent fiscal and current account deficits by successive governments were causes of the crisis. And I've already hinted at what that is, yeah, in terms of the numbers. And there's a whole lot of reasons for why this may be there. And the paper that I'm thinking about, I think there was a paper by, there's an ADB working paper by Dushni Veerakun and another colleague that looked at twin deficits. I think Chandra did something, you did something. So twin deficit stuff is there. Tenuwara did something in his paper. So there are a whole bunch of papers behind this twin deficit. So this was what I was talking about earlier, populist spending. Then on the demand side, the population has a strong preference for welfare. We like freebies. We like free health, we like free education, we like subsidies, we like subsidized bus fares, we like subsidized everything. So that's very strong. And then we like to have government jobs as a nice pathway from this subsidy. So there's a very clear political economy pathway. Public sector, some people say it's outsized. It's 1.4 billion people, if my memory serves me right. When you count full-time government plus casual and then something, 16%. And then large SOE losses. The public sector is large in labor force, economy force. And then we have these burdens on the SOE losses. Very limited tax base. And the tax cuts obviously made things worse. Very high dependence on trade taxes. Right? So much of the revenue comes from trade taxes rather than direct. And then we have this problem, the collection data. The 3 revenue agencies are problematic. And then the hit that comes from the declining grant and concession MDB funds, right, linked to our graduation. Right? So this gradual shock that was coming from graduation didn't get factored in probably enough. And then we shifted to foreign borrowing, ISBs, and then also Chinese commercial loans. So we talked a bit about that. And then on the foreign exchange side, we really didn't pay much attention to what they call non-debt rating foreign exchange. So ag was weak, right? And I've already talked about the plantation problem. And we sort of kill the golden goose that financed the wealth by getting these 50-acre plots, and productivity dropped, exports dropped, revenue dropped, etc. That was needed. Tourism arrivals for a country like this, less than 1 million, seems really very small. It should be 2, 3, 4 million perhaps, at least. And that's a potentially a good income earner. Manufactured exports are only in garments, they haven't gone much else. A little bit of electronics, a little bit of boat building, a little bit of processed rubber, a bit of processed food stuff. But really, it means that then we are very import dependent because we don't grow enough food and we don't make enough things, particularly what we're trying to do. And then we have this problem here. So this is the twin deficit kind of argument. So this definitely is an explanation. There is a problem there. Next slide, please. Then we have what we've all kind of lived is economic mismanagement. So you have this twin deficit historically, and then if you have in this 2019 to 2022 July episode, you have this whole series of kind of from the vistas of prosperity and splendor, splendor and prosperity. I always get it the wrong way around. You have this set of measures that talk about Sri Lanka growing at 6%, unemployment of 4%, inflation of under 2%, all these kind of numbers which have no economics behind it. And then we kind of see what that sort of means, right? So the fertilizer one, I think, was the best example, right? So overnight switch from chemical to organic fertilizer, and that definitely had a massive hit on ag. Keeping a fixed exchange rate beyond its shelf life was certainly another one, where the reserves were used to boost the currency. Imports controls, right, which were there early on to conserve foreign exchange. The use of foreign exchange swaps. So rather than going to the International Monetary Fund after COVID came in 2020, as many economists had recommended, including Silman, they did not do that. Instead of which they did these bilateral swaps, right? So they went to get money from India, they went to get money even from Bangladesh, $100 million, if I remember right. Then there was a 1 billion being sought from India, etc. So that was another part of the home. And then probably the worst was the delay in going to the IMF. So the day we defaulted, we had $25 million in the central bank. So how you go from 4.6 billion reserves to 25 million is a mystery to me, and why there is no early warning system in place and why it doesn't get excited early was a mystery. So there was definitely this picture of the economy under the watch of this administration that basically was a trigger, if not a greater distortion going into this. And for me, this is interesting because this was another bout of so-called alternative policies. And I have another paper on this, if anybody's interested, on assessing homegrown solutions. If anybody's interested, that's available. Then we start coming to the external factors. So this morning on a panel, we had Mr. Palyakara, who was our former foreign secretary, certainly a very august man. And he was sort of saying that the Chinese debt trap, if I heard him right, was a little bit of a Western and Indian creation. Now, that's not quite true. Sorry? Well, we can talk about that, and I'm about to tell you. It is true that Brahm Chelani did coin the word Sri Lanka in a Chinese debt trap, and he coined that in a very popular article that he wrote, which became viral. It is also true that people like Jeff Smith from Heritage used that word, and then CSIS and so on. So what does that actually mean in terms of topics? So debt trap means you willingly get a country into debt by giving them non-performing or non-useful loans where there's very good chance of economic rates of return, and then you seize their assets. I mean, that's the definition I understand from the IR literature. And I've looked at not just Sri Lanka and academics writing about this, But I also looked at people writing about this in the context of Ethiopia, where there's a railway to nowhere, in Ghana, where there's a dam that doesn't work. I've looked at it in many contexts. Right? So I've kind of thought about this a little. We wrote a paper for Chatham House when I was at LKI, based on Chinese loans to Sri Lanka. So we visited all the projects. Okay, so the lucky thing for my few years at ADB was that I managed to use my development banking brain to understand what is the rate of return on a project. So we went, and the short answer is Chinese loans to Sri Lanka between 2006 to 2022 was $13.2 billion. Okay, so that's how much they gave us. In 2021 end, it was roughly $7.6 billion of debt owed to China out of 50 odd billion. So that's about 15%, if my memory serves me. Okay, so on that basis, you can say private creditors were more. I think Howard Nicholas and others argue that we are in a private sector bondholder trap and not in a Chinese debt trap, and that he claims it's not true. The point is the 15 billion makes it the largest bilateral creditor to Sri Lanka. Yeah, so that's the key point. The second point, that's at the macro level, and we can argue about it. At the micro level, this is what's reduced. So we went to all the projects. Okay, we went in I think 2019, even earlier. And what you really get from that assessment is there's a mix of good projects and bad projects. So the good projects are things like the CICT terminal in Colombo, okay, which works and it helps us to export to India. And it's very much part of our transshipment trade. Without that terminal, Sri Lankan port may not be as export oriented to India. Very simple. And it's a very modern port. It's better than the John Keys, the other port that they have. I don't know what it will be compared to the Adani port because that's still coming up, so we don't. But that's the Norachore power plant. People have mixed views because it's a coal-fired power plant. But without that, would have been entirely reliant on hydropower and fluctuating with the weather, and that would have been an issue. So it's powered by coal and fuel and so on. But it gave us lights and therefore helped our garment transition. So that was important, particularly in the 200 garment factory. But Malkal Airport, Ahmedabad Port, the cricket stadium, the bird's nest, the tower, the Hollywood, were these part of development efforts? But all at 6% loans. So I conclude that there is a partial story from this story, and we should have been much better in our infrastructure master planning. We should have certainly done cost-benefit analysis of projects. And here's the world's expert of cost-benefit analysis, Dr. Gunnar. He did this at ADB for a living, right? Right, he did this. He can tell you what internal rates of return. And I can tell you about those to the extent I remember it. So that was the problem. Okay, we didn't factor in a proper process of this. So there is a partial debt trap for sure. Now, I cannot believe for a moment the Chinese did not know what they were doing in southern Sri Lanka. I have visited China 20 times. I've been to Guangzhou, I've been to Shenzhen, I've been all over. Their infrastructure is unparalleled. And the way they plan and build this stuff is something else, right? They didn't do that here. I cannot believe that they didn't know what they were doing here. Okay. The result for Sri Lanka is very clear. The last issue, of course, is the shocks. And the shocks, of course, played a role. I mean, most economies in South Asia and elsewhere were hit by shocks. The pandemic was the worst, and it definitely, played havoc with any plans to do things usefully. And then on top of that came the Russia-Ukraine conflict. But then other economies also had shocks. Nepal had a shock. Bangladesh had a shock. Cambodia had a shock. Laos. But none of them came into this scenario of things that we. So there were definitely other explanations. So what I conclude from all this is that internal factors, the twin deficits, and the mismanagement were fundamental in causing our crisis, while these were partial. Yeah. So having thought about it a lot, this is the conclusion I come to. So it's an internal set of issues that leads to some of this reversal. Okay, so that was the conclusion I got. It's not external in that sense. Next slide, please. Here is the data of debt. And I deliberately don't update this because the definition of debt that's used, I think a year ago or 2 years ago, the central bank changed the way in which they look at debt and they moved some debt across and so on. So the numbers aren't quite comparable. I think it's probably the article report. So China's number was some 7 point this, that's its basic extent in GDP, and government of China and the rest of it. So this is the data. And then you have the private credit number, which is obviously bigger, and so on. Yeah, next slide, please. Okay, so cures for the crisis. When I say cures, I'm really talking about things that may have been there that helped us come to the stabilization position. That's what I'm talking about. Okay, next slide, please. So there were three things that I think are interesting. One is even before the IMF program came, I think starting about August, September, the government of the day, under Mr. Vikram Singh and the central bank, did a series of things to make the economy in a better place to where we were. So the central bank hiked interest rates. Interest rates were raised to some 20-odd%. So this is a big jump because inflation was 70-odd%, remember, in October that year. So they had to take care of inflation because that was seen as the main problem in the economy. They also floated the exchange rate. That was another very. And they took steps to safeguard the stability of the banking system. They performed stress tests on the banks. Because what often happens in a case like Sri Lanka, which defaults, is you have not just the main crisis affecting the external accounts, but you have a domestic banking crisis, which then causes tremendous misery for the population. Imagine Argentina, imagine Lebanon. The banking system collapses. You all have $1 million rupees in savings. That's suddenly worth 500,000, and which you can only take out 100,000. Imagine what would have happened had that occurred. Okay. That, it's a terrible plight. You all have all seen the pictures, I'm sure, of people queuing up cash machines in Greece when the banking crisis came. Right? We've seen it in other countries. Okay. That didn't happen, and that's really thanks to the central bank. A lot of it. And Siriman and I sit on a committee, and we are aware of some of the actions that they took. The government also tried to do some things. It's true that President Gotabaya went to the IMF, but they hadn't appointed a law firm and the debt advisor, as far as I'm saying, which need to the process. This was done afterwards, and that helped the IMF. And diplomacy was used, including reaching out to the head of the IMF to get sure we got the program. And the Indian finance minister herself intervened in that discussion with the IMF. That I know, and the Indian ED matters for our constituency in the IMF. The Sri Lankan is the alternate ED, doesn't have the same kind of power, and the Indian ED is a much more senior bureaucrat, and they were very persuasive in the IMF. Taxes were raised, recurrent expenditure somewhat curtailed, the restrictions on imports were continued. Then you have the reform that I guess is very important, is the fuel reform that took place. Fuel price formula was introduced, and then opening up to foreign petroleum companies. That's important here. And then you had this privatization program, which we're waiting to see what results are. Then the fund program comes a year or later. We all know about this, so I won't spend much time. And then what's often forgotten here was this. This $4 billion given by India in 2022 really helped keep the Sri Lankan economy afloat because there was no foreign exchange and there was no ability to import. And India provided lots of credits and other kinds of money in order to keep the Sri Lankan economy afloat. And there were, on top of this, there were the RBI swaps, which I think are very important as well. Now, this money, I did a number that looked at what Indian aid was in that year and how much they gave us. They gave us 10% of their overseas aid budget in any 1 year. So, and they're not given so much. So that was a really interesting thing. Now it was for various motivations. One was the neighborhood first. Another was pressure from South India. The third was South Bloc and North Bloc also in Delhi thinking if Sri Lankan economy sinks, it will also be an issue for India in its own backyard. If it has a country that then goes down, it cannot claim to be a global leader. And at the same time, it makes us even more vulnerable to what they would call hostile countries in India. And so there were many reasons why there was also a humanitarian motive. So there's a mixed set of reasons why they helped us. And then also probably wanting to make Sri Lanka part of the Indian sphere of integration in economic terms. So there are lots of motivations, right? It's hard to tell which one was dominant and not, but there were at least these set of things. Next slide, please. Okay, let's talk about 2024, where we are now, in July. Next slide, please. Okay, so inflation has come down 4% or so. Rupees around 300. Liquidity pressures have eased. This number I quote here is not the official gross number, it's minus the swap, which we still can't use as far as I know. Chinese swaps of 3-point-something billion. 2.5 months of imports anymore, roughly. Yeah, 2.5, no? So we're not yet at that magical 3-month thing, right? And the conversation is about which cars we should. So it's a very interesting thing in our mind. I would love a new car, but I'd rather we had food and other things. Okay, so it's very interesting what you see. And then there are these issues that are still problem. Taxes rose, which is challenging, and particularly VAT, which is aggressive. Growth is positive, we think, but there's a range of forecasts: 1.9% ADB, which is normally more pessimistic. I wonder why ADB was more pessimistic this time. ADB is very country friendly, for what I remember always. If we had a number that was less than the World Bank, our chief economist said, raise the number. Not joking. Not true. But ADB usually is very friendly to countries. Here's a number where we are being much more strong. Central Bank is much more friendly to the country, as we expect. And World Bank is somewhere in the middle. Next slide, please. And then you're seeing G2G FDI. But not much private, right? So the Colombo Port example is there. And that's, okay, so that's an interesting project because it's got Adani, it's got John Keels, it's got US DFC guaranteeing it all. So there's a state element, and if Adani is an Indian foreign policy tool in some way, then there's a G2G there. And then this for sure is a G2C led thing, I think. So all of this is kind of happening, but we don't see much private investment in manufacturing, which is what we kind of want, or in ag, which is again what we want. And there are lots of reasons. I mean, if a country is defaulted, people may not want to put much money in, because you may not get paid. Very simple. Second, till we get the relevant laws and so on in place and cut the red tape, the regulatory infrastructure may deter you. So there are lots of reasons why people may not invest, but to the extent we have G2G coming in, that's quite useful. Next slide, please. Okay, lots of challenges, which you may see. Will this Sinopec monopoly be a private monopoly? We also have a couple of others coming in, so we might have an oligopoly. Who's going to regulate for this? CPC. Okay, 2 minutes and I'll finish. 5 minutes, I'll finish. 5 minutes. Great. Growth, we want 5%. Sri Lanka has to really be very careful about its geopolitical relationships. Debt restructuring, I'm going to come back to that in a minute. And we have these political. So there are lots of issues that are still there. So we're not out of the woods, although we have stabilized, we're not out of the woods. But certainly compared to the dark days, we're in a better place, at least in the fact we can have this seminar. Next slide, please. Lots of issues about the IMF program. Can revenue be increased to meet the target? Can the central bank resist political pressures for monetary financing in election year and beyond? Would there be a banking crisis that may come? Will the governance reforms ever be implemented? I don't know the answers to this. But there are lots of issues here. Next slide, please. Okay, lastly, the lessons. Few minutes after. Next slide. So the first lesson, and I'm pretending I'm in Bangladesh, or I'm in Malaysia, I'm not in Sri Lanka, I'm not in Kerala. Okay, so I'm talking to you all as if what you want to learn from this experience of Sri Lanka. Okay. The first is go into the IMF if you're in a crisis. And by the way, we have personal experience. Siriman and I were part of a report in another think tank. Vishan mentioned the name. And we wrote a report and we saw all 3 leaders of the time, right? And we presented the report, and the report was all about why they should go to the IMF. Yeah. Sadly, we didn't get listened to. So go to the IMF because the conditionality that will get imposed on you will be less than what it is today. You have more room to negotiate what you might do, etc. All right. Secondly, swaps. Swaps are really currency swaps with, say, Bangladesh or with India or anybody else are really short-term measures. They're really about cash flow, helping your reserve boost. They're not a long-term way to manage your debt. And we need to look at the conditions. So the reason I show you the usable reserve number rather than the gross reserves, that also contains a Chinese swap of 1.5 billion, which they gave us the height of a crisis. And that has conditions on usage. Firstly, it's in yuan, and Chinese exporters don't want yuan, they want dollars. Okay, so we couldn't use it to import things from China. Second, 3 months of import cover has to be there before we can use it. And that's why I asked him how many months of imports cover there is. So swaps have also issues. And then we need safety nets, which are terribly important. And they should be targeted properly. And I think you are doing some work on this, which is very interesting, how we improve our targeting system. Because there are two types, there's type 1 and type 2 errors, right? People who should be getting who are not getting, and people who shouldn't be getting who are getting, right? So there is a problem here. And I think we have to think about some rationing. If the poverty numbers are so high, we have to think of some rationing. I think we have to think about that. With whatever surpluses we get, we should consider some kind of ration system, because we need to make sure there is a flow. And as a human right, we have to ensure this child malnutrition is dealt with. I mean, this to me is just unthinkable in a country like Sri Lanka, that children are suffering. I have sleepless nights if I think about this. Next slide, please. A macro regulator is terribly important. So we had failure during the crisis of the main macroeconomic institution that kept saying, things like don't go to the IMF, spend all the reserves on keeping the currency afloat, spend the gold, etc., and don't control inflation, adopt modern monetary theory, etc. Sadly, those all turned out to be misplaced assumptions. So you need a central bank that is free of these kinds of pressures and deficit financing obligations, and be sufficiently autonomous to make those tough decisions. Now, that's very difficult in our political economy scenario we are in. And one hopes that the central bank independence gets preserved, because it imposes fiscal discipline on government. If we also have the Public Finance Management Act there, which means you have to spend according to what you can tax. And then when you eventually get what you can from the capital market, you may supplement that money, and you might also borrow from bilaterals, but those have to be projects that are going to be good rates of return. Crisis management capabilities obviously matter a lot. So there was this committee, I think, established on poverty, chaired by Sir Basil Rajapaksa during the crisis. And that was supposed to solve things. And I think it was a big committee with lots of people. I don't think many people spoke in that committee, from what I understand. So really you need something of this type with analytical capacity to help you manage a crisis and so on. Next slide, please. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so the default and the fallout was the worst crisis, and the two interplay, of course. The shocks did play a role. The government and the IMF and Indian aid have changed the outlook, but we are in a stabilization story, but with these big risks. And then there's the health one, right? We have till 2028 a grace period on our bilateral credit, and we think so by that time we have to start paying it back. And in the interim, we also get World Bank and ADB money as well, some of it, right? But in 2028, we have to start paying. And then also the private creditor agreement, we think, is being negotiated. We think that the interest payments may be due from September, October this year, and then the capital will be due in 2028. Right? So we had this grace period available. In 29-30, if we are not careful, this might mean the sad direction we may go. So it's to kind of get people's mindsets clear of where we are and what we were. And I was trying to do this paper in a kind of a backward look at recent history. Thank you very much. I hope it was of some use to you.
Thank you, Dr. Vipin Raja from Nagpur Medical College. Actually, how would I describe this presentation? It's a very comprehensive presentation with some in-depth analysis as to how Sri Lanka ended up as a country with this current economic crisis. But all in all, I think Ganesh did a great job in analyzing, and also we had a very interesting, exciting discussion. And let me thank all of you for coming, and finally, Ganesh for the excellent job you did in Seva.